Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tony and I will be moderating today's session. With that, I would like to begin today's conference and turn the call over to Jonathan Whiting for our opening remarks. Jonathan, please go ahead.
All right, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jonathan Whiting, and I'm a part of a team from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory that manages the TEFIS database. For those who are unfamiliar, TEFIS collects and distributes information about the potential environmental effects of wind and marine renewable energy, and serves as a common for large international audience through the Ocean Energy Systems and Explore initiative. Today we have the privilege to hear about some great work being done by our partners in the UK. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available publicly on TEFIS to be shared with those who are unable to attend today. I would now like to hand it over to Dr. Bjorn Elaser from Queen's Belfast University, who will give an introduction to the project.
Jonathan, thank you very much. Dear participants, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you call us. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the project, abbreviated LINC, Large-Scale Interactive Coupled Modeling of Environmental Impacts of Marine Renewable Energy Farms. So I'm just starting off with this very busy screen here at the very beginning. I'd just like to point out, so this has been funded as part of the SuperGen call, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a UK-funded, EPSRC-funded call with the partners here at the top being the core partners and some of the partners that have contributed to the projects here at the bottom. The projects encompass all parts of marine renewable, wave and tidal, largely technical and engineering aspects. So this project is one of two projects in the latest call that really focused on environmental issues. So what is the LINC project about? It's really about predicting environmental impacts of very large marine renewable farms. So we're not talking about one or two tidal turbines or one or two wave power plants. We're talking really about very large wave power plants or tidal turbines. And really the driver for the study was the understanding that impact assessments that need to be conducted pretty much everywhere around the world these days are very time consuming. They tend to be reactive. Let's stick the thing in and see what happens. Very costly, and for those of you familiar with statistics, a test for null hypothesis of absence is a bit tricky. So quite often the answers are not necessarily that conclusive. I just want to quickly introduce the partners which will be speaking throughout today's presentation. So ourselves here, Queen's University in Belfast, we have expertise in wave, tidal and ecological modeling, largely using a commercial software package called Mike by DHI or Mike 21. We have a wave tank, or actually two wave tanks, and some full-scale tidal stream expertise and facilities, and a strong background in environmental impact assessment, in particular with regards to the CGen turbine. We then also have Imperial College. Dave Colley will be joining us. They're the developers of the Fluidity ICOM software package, developer of just general ocean scale circulation models, and they collaborate with the tidal stream developer. And the third partner is CFAS. CFAS are the Center of Ecology, Fisheries and Aquaculture Sciences. Julian, I hope I got this right. Key agency in the UK for research in environmental impact assessment, and they have a strong expertise in wind farm development and various other aspects associated with ocean energy. We also have a number of stakeholders which were involved in the project, such as device developers, site developers, consultants, and regulators. So what was the original aim and objective of the project? Well, first of all, we wanted to demonstrate that we can actually numerically model within reasonable accuracy the change in the ambient hydrodynamics as a result of the installation of wave and tidal device arrays. In this presentation, we largely focus on tidal device arrays, but we also have some information on wave as well. And then secondly, to couple the model outputs of these hydrodynamic models with ecological models to predict changes in benthic habitats, for example, or dynamics, plankton growth, fish communities, and others. So the approach really was to take a number of software packages listed here, Mike, Fluidity, Gotham, Ursum, and then apply these to a number of problems. The advantage of using this approach really is to the outputs of the results are not model specific, and there's quite a considerable amount of open source tools available, as well as commercially used software. So just to conclude the introduction, what you'll be listening to is some details on hydrodynamic modeling. We then have a review of some of the particle tracking modeling that we've done. We then move on to really big-scale geochemistry models, just to then take it back onto NPZD, so again, nutrient models on a slightly smaller scale. We'll have a quick hydroacoustic presentation on some measurements and some sort of theoretical considerations. And then we'll be closing off with a web-based application to look at impact assessment and identifying potential issues. I've also listed here assessing benthic distribution. We're not going to have a presentation on that, but there's some interesting information available for people who are interested. Just before I hand over to Dave, the next speaker at Imperial College, as mentioned before, you can ask questions. We'll have a question and answer session at the very end. If you please use the note function for asking those questions, and if they're particular to one presentation, if you could indicate presentation 1, 2, 3, and so on to make it a little bit clearer for us. So I'll hand over to Dave.
I'm Dave from Imperial College, and I'm talking today about the optimization of tidal turbine array design and how that impacts upon performance. So hopefully you should be convinced, or if not, this slide should convince you that the layout of the individual turbines within an array can affect the performance of that array to quite a significant degree. So on the left you can see power with respect to the longitudinal transverse spacing of 2 rows of staggered turbines. And as that changes, obviously the power output by the array changes as well. So traditionally, there are sort of 3 approaches to optimizing an array. The first is the most common, just using human intuition, where sort of a designer takes his best guess at what he thinks the best layout is going to be, and then tests that or analyzes that using a high fidelity, often commercial code, which is obviously very expensive to run, so limits the number of different options the designer can trial. The second option is to use is to do sort of global optimization, so that's without gradient data. And this usually requires large number of iterations, so we're talking about optimization methods like genetic optimization or ant colony algorithms. And because of the large number of iterations we need, we have to use computationally cheap, normally uncoupled sort of perturbation approaches. So we compute the ambient flow and then we superpose the turbines on top of that, which have pre-computed weight deficits. This means that the physics of the problem aren't that well captured, and issues like blockage may not be represented. And then the third approach is to use gradient data, which is what we do with a code we've developed here called Open Tidal Farm. And the key here is that we're using a fully coupled shallow water model, and because we're using gradient-based optimization, we have far fewer iterations, so we can afford for each one of those iterations to be more expensive, higher fidelity, and hence more accurate. So what that sort of looks like for this sort of simple channel with an island in the middle, you can see at the top is the optimization with the coupled shallow water model, so you can see the weights coming off the turbines and how the flow has been redirected around the north of the island, as compared to as compared to a parameter longitudinal and transverse spacing optimization at the bottom. So allowing the turbines to have those more freedom of movement so they're not confined to rows helps produce more power and gives array formations which aren't necessarily what a human designer would come up with. So this scales very nicely, so even with very large arrays. At the top left we can see a movie made up of consecutive iterations of the optimization. So as the optimization progresses, the turbines get put in progressively more high-performing locations. And this is just formulated as an optimization problem where we're maximizing the power with respect to the flow and this parameter m, which captures the locations of each of the individual turbines. And that's subject to the shallow water equations, some boundary constraints which limit the turbines to remaining in the turbine area, and then some inequality constraints which ensure that turbines don't sit on top of each other and they stay a minimum distance away. So in each iteration we solve the shallow water equations. We then determine the gradient of the power with respect to the locations of the individual turbines using the adjoint approach, and then we improve those locations iteratively until we have returned the optimal layout. So our turbines are represented by bumps of increased bottom friction, and these can be parameterized so that they're taking some realistic thrust and power curve values. As I said, M captures the locations of all the turbines, and you can see how we're computing the power and putting that together into the optimization approach here. So this works nicely even for relatively large domains. So here we've got the most of the inner sound. Obviously we're cutting off scarp of flow at the top, but going down to an order of 2 meters in the red turbine area beneath the island of stroma there. And we can add realistic bathymetry and realistic tidal forcing, and obviously with the realistic turbine parameterization. And I don't know how well the videos are coming out, but hopefully this is illustrating that the flow produced by the shallow water model is relatively good, especially given that we're iterating this numerous times because it's an optimization. So there's obviously a necessity to keep the model relatively cheap in order to keep that tractable. And then the kind of the output of the layout of those turbines in the inner sound looks something like this. So you can broadly see that several barrages have formed, and showing that with the streamlines of the ebb flow, you can see that those barrages have aligned themselves more or less perpendicular to the streamlines, and in the opposite direction, again, they're more or less perpendicular to the streamlines. So that's a fairly convincing layout that perhaps a human wouldn't have come to. The nice thing about having easy access to gradient data through the adjoint is that we can also do sensitivity analysis in a fairly straightforward manner. So on the left you can see the sensitivity with respect to depth of the domain, and you can see broadly what you'd expect. The red showing that by increasing the depth would increase the power, and the blue showing that decreasing the depth would increase the power. So you can see sort of a funneling effect through the turbine array here. And this might be useful for developers to see which parts of the domain are most affecting the model's power output and ensure that they've surveyed those areas of the domain properly. This is a similar plot for bottom friction. So again, blue shows that reduced bottom friction would increase power. So this again highlights where developers are going to want to put their modeling and surveying effort. An alternate parameterization of the turbines, instead of representing the turbines individually, we also have a mode where you can represent them as continuous functions of friction, and this enables us to model much larger areas. So here you can see we're doing the whole of, well, a lot of the Orkney Islands with those 4 sites in the Pentland Firth that have been earmarked for development. And this enables us to optimize the farms together. So assuming that all 4 array developers are working together, what is the optimal design of each farm which maximizes the power output for everyone? Or we can look at how they're working, if they're working independently or in conflict, so if everyone optimizes for themselves, how that array layout might differ. And you can see those optimized plots of friction to the side. And if you sort of imagine that the red is where you place turbines or a higher concentration of turbines, again you can see sort of barrages forming broadly perpendicular to the streamlines. Perhaps more related to this project, we've also got some more realistic constraints. So for example, environmental constraints. So the sort of box hanging off the bottom of Stromer Island there is a designated ecozone, and we apply a penalty if the flow through that zone is changed from the ambient by placing turbines. So we have that turbine area to the south of Stromer there, and as we tune those, the cost of preserving that domain, the array that comes out changes. So if we have very stringent constraints, not allowing the flow through that domain to change at all, then obviously it's going to place less turbines and place them in a less efficient position, so as to affect that flow to a lesser degree. And then some future work that I'm particularly interested in is looking at uncertainty and robust optimization. Is there a way to, well, firstly quantify the uncertainty surrounding the performance of the array designs that we're producing, and secondly, is there a potential to produce array designs which are inoculated against that uncertainty, so perhaps perform less optimally in the model, but are more robust in deployment, allowing the developer to kind of reduce his risk. So hopefully you're convinced that array layout is an important thing when it comes to turbine array performance, that it requires a formal optimization approach where turbines are free to move individually. Because of the computationally intensiveness of that procedure, we use gradient methods and shallow water models, and the benefits of having those gradient-based methods and the access to the gradient is the sensitivity analysis we can carry out on the domain. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dave. I'm going to be the next presenter this afternoon, so welcome everybody to the talk. My name's Louise Creekdean from Queen's University Belfast, and the talk I'll be giving this today is, can we use particle tracking models to investigate the effects of tidal energy device arrays on transport processes? There we go. So to start with, it's all about the organism transport in the environment. Plankton communities, which are comprised of a number of different organisms in the environment, they can be transported very large distances by water motion. They can also remain in the water column for quite some time, up to anywhere between a few days, a month, and even up to over a year time in the actual water column drifting around. Obviously, they're a very important group of organisms as they provide food source for a lot of higher trophic levels, such as the mammals, fish, and invertebrates. But the water motion itself also assists importantly for dispersal processes, and this is important for things like reef connectivity between different areas, as well as ensuring sources and sinks for different larval sources. Obviously, the input of a lot of tidal arrays will actually influence hydrodynamics, and obviously this may potentially change transport patterns. And I'm just showing here, this is actually from CGen itself, looking down the narrows. You can see quite clearly that the hydrodynamics there's a lot of water motion coming off, or changes in turbulence coming off the pile there, which actually extends quite some distance from it. So this is just one device. If you can imagine, if you ramp this up to, 5 to 50 odd devices or even more, that you're going to obviously have some influence on hydrodynamics. Obviously, the potential problems that this may have is that it could actually stop species reaching suitable habitats or reaching the original habitat that they would get to if there was no influence on the hydrodynamics. And obviously this has a potential for trophic relationships or potentially a knock-on effect. If the particular larvae can't reach the substrate that they usually would get to over a certain period of given time, this may have implications for higher trophic levels. So when we actually look at transport processes, there's actually two mechanisms that you need to consider. The first one is the advection. And basically, advection describes the transport of, or the movement of a water particle from, say, A to B. Generally, we sort of describe this as the mean water flow or the parameter U. Dispersion is also a very important mechanism. It creates, obviously, the motion in all sort of directions, and it's influenced by the turbulence and the concentration gradients in the water. So we need to consider both of these mechanisms when we're looking at how to model these transport processes. Particle tracking models have been used to do this. They've been used in the engineering community for a long time now to simulate the fate of dissolved and suspended substances. The actual particle tracking module itself, though, has to be coupled to a hydrodynamic model, so you need a very robust, reliable hydrodynamic model to start with before you can even consider coupling it with a particle tracking model, and to ensure that what you're modelling is going to be correct. Obviously, you can now we're starting to use these particle tracking modules more and more for establishing the hydrodynamic influence on biological processes. So, just what else particle tracking models have been used for, and we've been using them for a few different processes now. So, one of the ones is actually structuring population genetics in the environment. You can use the particle tracking model to determine the distance and dispersal processes between different populations. We've been using it for things like seaweeds and how hydrodynamics may influence their genetic structure. The connectivity of larvae, obviously sources and sinks is very important in the environment, and how we've been able to use these particle tracking models to actually determine where a source is for a certain particular species and where their sink may be, using these successfully with both mussels and oysters. Obviously, for sediment transport processes, you can use a particle tracking model. Sediment is one of the significant influences, or one of the areas that's of concern when we're putting in hydrodynamic arrays of tidal energy devices. So we can use a particle. They're very versatile tools. Particle tracking is a versatile tool, but the question now is, can we actually use them to predict transport effects of tidal energy devices? So the aim of this work was actually to look at the considerations of using the particle tracking models, and it's more in a high flow environment, because all these other environments that we've been looking at are generally on the order, they're sort of like half a metre or a metre maximum velocity speed, whereas when we're talking about tidal array environments, we're talking up to 3 to 5 metres a second. So it's a bit of a different area, and the way we've been doing this is using the Micro21 modelling software by DHI, and looking at how to simulate the influence of tidal energy arrays on transport. So as I mentioned earlier, you need a hydrodynamic model to start with, a good hydrodynamic model. So we've developed this idealized model setup. It's been used throughout the group, and it's been well looked into for the flows and making sure everything's correct with it. It's a depth average domain, and it has it has over 54,000 cells. But you can see here the actual base itself the 100 meters, it means actually that each cell size is about 100 meters in cell size, whereas in the narrows itself is only 10 meter cell size, and then out in the open there is up to 800 meters. And this is to ensure that, obviously for runtime and computational cost, the area of interest is obviously in the narrows here and also within the basin. We used a tidal-free surface forcing on the open boundary, and we ran the model at a 5-minute time step. The turbine placement within the Mike DHI software, it has a nice function that you can actually put in turbines themselves. We basically use the CGen as the prototype for the device. So basically, it has a pile and 2 rotors. The turbine placement was either with just no devices, obviously the control, 1 device that was in the middle there. We had also 5 devices in the centre, and then we also have obviously the whole 55 devices. Now, the actual design is to provide corridors. So obviously, we can't lay tidal turbines over the whole narrows there, because it would just, for shipping purposes, it would be not appropriate. So we're trying to sort of have some form of reality in the model itself, and the distance between the turbines was 200 meters. This is just to show sort of the difference in current speed that you're getting, so that we know that we are getting a change in hydrodynamics. So around 55 turbines, you can see that there's almost up to a 0.7 meters of difference between when you have no turbines and when you have 55 turbines. So we know that there is quite a lot of change in the velocity going on around the devices and also out into the actual basin itself. Once we've now established that we've got a good hydrodynamic model, we can then move on to the actual particle tracking module, which is coupled nicely with the hydrodynamic model. The approach that the particle tracking module actually takes is using the Lagrangian approach. There was also a Eulerian approach, but we've sort of looked into that and decided that the Lagrangian is probably more easier to use, especially in the Mike DHI software. It's also probably more user-friendly for other groups, for other users. We put in 7 sources, which means that at the entrance in the large area, we have 7 different groups, 7 areas that are releasing particles continually. We release particles just on the incoming tides. It's sort of simulating anything that's coming in from the open ocean into the bay. And we release them at about 10 meters above the substrate. That can be altered, but for this particular talk, we did it 10 meters above the substrate. And that sort of would be influenced by the CGen itself, which is the rotors sitting about 15 meters above the substrate. But when you look at the particle tracking module, and as I said, it was a high-flow environment, the question to ask is how many particles you actually release per time step. So to first answer that, we actually did a convergence study, basically released 1, 5, 10, 60, and 120 particles per time step, and then just extracted a transect across the channel. And this was after a 1 tidal flow, so we could have a look at how stable the particles, the number of particles get depending on how many you release. So basically, if we look at 1 particle, there's a lot of fluctuation throughout that whole transect, so that's obviously not appropriate. With just 5 particles as well, it's also fluctuating quite a lot. And 10, you're sort of getting a bit more stable, but obviously 60 and 120, there's actually quite stable across the whole length of the transect there. We chose 60 here for 60 particles per time step instead of 120. 120 actually increases the runtime quite significantly, so that's also another consideration to take when you're running these models, how long it takes to actually run the particle tracking models. So we chose 60 particles for the remainder of this talk. The next question, and this is actually a very important one, and I can honestly say we don't quite have an answer for it yet, because you need to validate this, and this is actually the horizontal dispersion factor. Generally, in most environments, we use a horizontal dispersion factor of 1 or 1.1 if there is a bit of turbulence in the environment. However, you can see here that using 1, those 7 sources that we released provide their discrete packets of particles coming into the narrows, even through the turbine there. So even if we use a horizontal dispersion factor of 2, you're still getting quite discrete packets. If you've moved to 5, then it's a little bit more dispersed, which is probably more reality because we don't believe you get in such a high flow turbulent environment that you would have discrete packets of particles. And obviously 10 is probably well too dispersed. So we've actually chosen 5, but I have to stress that this needs validation, and that's something that needs to be in the future. But for now, we've used 5 for the horizontal dispersion for the incoming particles coming into the model, the bay. So this is sort of sums up the results. Basically, you can see that after, this is run for a 30-day simulation, so there's quite a lot of particles sort of ending up in the beginning and end region. And obviously, because it's an idealized model, there's not probably too much water flow at the back here. But so you see large differences in spatial patterns of transport into the lagoon here. And just to show that the difference between when you have no turbines and when you have 55 turbines, basically where 95% of the mass accumulates, basically in this first 1/3 roughly of the basin, you actually get only a 2% observed change in the particles. Obviously, this looks more as you get further away, but as I say, this is very low levels of particles here anyway, so the difference between particles at the control and 55, it's sort of exaggerated, if you like. But the main feature here is that even in the first areas where 95% of the mass accumulates, there's only about a 2% change between the simulations, so control versus turbines. So this is what the way that we have it set up, so 60 particles and a dispersion, horizontal dispersion of 5. So we now have a very good understanding of the actual Mike 21 flexible mesh transport code. We've done a lot of work around it, seeing how it works in different scenarios. So we're more confident with using the PT approach and believe the conclusions that we would get if you were to actually try and use this in a real-world simulation, a situation would be quite valid. Obviously, in an ideal world, it'd be good to use field data to validate, especially, and as I say, in the horizontal dispersion of it. And any future work, we'd like to carry this on because this is obviously an idealized model, but you've got a lot of natural variation in, well, as we call it, introduced noise, such as the wind effects. They might have influence on and how they influence particle tracking, but also use it in a real world, a real model of a real area with top of bathymetry, also headlands and points jutting out, and just natural turbulent flows in a natural environment, and see how this goes. So for more information, please contact me. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you. Well, hello everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. What I would like to talk about in this presentation is about the potential large-scale effects of tidal energy extraction in the Pentland Firth. And what I'm going to use is a very large-scale model that includes biogeochemistry. So we've seen this map before. This shows the licensed power extraction in the Pentland Firth, summing up to about 800 megawatts. And what we're going to assume in this study is that this power will actually be extracted. We'll look at tides, we'll look at biogeochemistry and primary production and potential effects on the benthic system. And for that, I have used the Gettemers BFM model that I will introduce over the next couple of slides. So the hydrodynamic model setup for Gettem covers the whole of the Northwest European continental shelf. It's got a resolution of approximately 5 kilometers in the horizontal, 25 layers in the vertical, so it's a 3-dimensional model, and it's driven by tidal forcing at the open boundaries, winds, temperature from meteorological models, river runoff from an observational database, and also temperature and salinity at open boundaries, including nutrient concentrations for the biogeochemical model. So this slide shows some results of the validation of the tidal model that I've carried out. And if you look at the lower right-hand corner figure, then that zooms in on the area of North Scotland over the Pentland Firth, showing differences with observations of this model of just a few centimeters. Similarly, if we look at the southern North Sea, typical differences with observations are in the range of a few centimeters. In the Irish Sea, the situation is slightly different, and here we can see differences of up to several tens of centimeters. This is a result of for this area, fairly coarse resolution of the numerical model, and this can be improved if you would use a higher resolution model. Now, the bottom graph shows for a location in the Pentland Firth, and this is the central location in the Pentland Firth where most of the tide is running through, a comparison of observed tidal current velocities in the red dots and the modeled velocities in the blue line, and for us this is evidence that in the very least in the vicinity of the Pentland Firth, but also somewhat further afield, the tidal model is well enough, even at the fairly coarse resolution that we had to use to address to the problem at hand. So how did we implement the tidal power extraction? This is sort of summarized on this slide. We've assumed main dimensions and power extraction of a commercially available tidal stream generator, rotors of 1 megawatt each, rotor diameters of about 20 meters, and an assumed thrust coefficient. In the blue box on the right-hand side, you can see the mathematical description of how that is implemented in the model. Now, we've looked at two scenarios. The first scenario is the 800 megawatt scenario that is aimed at for licensing, and the second scenario is a massive expansion scenario where we have multiplied that extraction by a factor of 10, extracting 8 gigawatts. And if you look at the figure in the top right-hand corner, you can see how the model resolves the Pentland Firth, which is at a fairly coarse resolution, and it's evident that we cannot distribute in this model the tidal turbines in the way that the licensed areas are distributed. So we've chosen to just spread them evenly over the entire surface area of the Pentland So this model will not be able to, as we've seen in the first presentation, look into the intricate detail of what's actually happening around the turbines and within the pendulum firth, but it's aimed at looking at much larger scale effects. So if we look at the first results, some results for the difference in SIS and tide. So these two maps are a difference between the scenario run, so that's the 800 megawatt scenario or the 8 gigawatt scenario, and the reference run, which was carried out without tidal turbines. And if we look at the 800 megawatt scenario, then you can see, and these are pictures for tidal elevations, that we get differences in the order of just a few millimeters. So that is very little, and I think at current technology that it wouldn't be possible to even measure those differences. So that's very small. However, if we go to the massive expansion scenario, we can see that these differences grow and get up to the level of several centimeters, with an increase in tidal elevations at the Atlantic side of the Pentland Firth, and a decrease in tidal elevations along the east coast of the UK all the way down to East Anglia over here of several centimeters. And these differences would be picked up by tide gauge networks. So what we ultimately aimed for was to also simulate effects on the marine environment, and for that we coupled the ERSIM BFM model, European Regional Seas Ecosystem Model, to this hydrodynamical model. And on this slide shows a representation of the food web in the pelagic and in the benthic system in this model. And I'm not going to go into the intricate detail of how this all works and how all these boxes interact, but a few highlights are that there are a number of phytoplankton groups, a number of zooplankton groups. The model deals with detritus, nutrient transport, and then in the benthic system there's a flow of material into the seabed through suspension feeders, which is then distributed through various mechanisms over other functional groups inside and on top of the benthic system. And these could be macro species. So also for this, of course, it's good to do some validation, and in this slide you can see an example of some of the things we've done. The yellow dot on the map here indicates the location of one of the CFAS smart buoys, and this is a system that we operate almost continuously to monitor the environmental conditions at this location. And on the map you can see that that's not the only buoy we operate. We have a number distributed over the shelf seas around the UK. And in the graphs you can see a comparison of these smart buoy observations in the red crosses with the model results for these parameters at the smart buoy location in the model. So we've got suspended sediment concentrations, sort of mimicking the seasonal cycle, but overshooting the extreme events. Chlorophyll concentrations also representing the seasonal cycle, but sometimes having the spring bloom slightly early. And nutrient concentrations in the models, silicate and nitrate, as depicted here. Again, representing the seasonal cycle, but overestimating. What we see in the model, and I'm not going to show that here, is that these nutrient concentrations are simulated better the further out to see, you get, we do have a problem with these in coastal areas, which we're currently addressing. So the next slide gives a more spatial comparison of the model, in this case with chlorophyll, a chlorophyll product from the MODIS satellite, which you can see in the upper right-hand panel. And this is a summer composite. In the second panel on the right-hand side, you can see the number of cloud-free days that composite this picture. And if you look at the numbers, then out of 180 days in this 6-month composite, we get about 40, 50, sometimes 60 or a little bit more cloud-free days. So that's a proportion of the total in this fairly clouded area. Now, if you look at the right-hand top level, then this represents the true model average over this 6-month summer period of chlorophyll in the model. And of course, there are differences with the satellite observations, but at some level this is not a good comparison, because the model contains all the 150 days, whereas the satellite observation contains a fraction of that, depending on where you are in the area. So what we've done, and this is the second panel down on the left-hand side, is we've subsampled the model results to reflect the actual days at which the satellite saw clear skies and actually measured chlorophyll. So the best comparison to be made is between the top right-hand corner with a figure which is the satellite observations, and the second figure on the left, which represents the model representation of that. And if you compare the two figures on the left-hand side, the top and the middle, you can sort of see the influence of having removing those cloudy days from the picture. Now, the two bottom figures are statistical measures of the goodness of fit of the model results to the satellite observation. So on the left-hand side at the bottom, we have the model bias, which is sort of the average difference between the model results and the satellite observations. And we can see that in large areas, in the very least offshore, the values of this model bias are fairly small. In coastal areas, the model over-predicts chlorophyll concentrations to a factor of 2 to 3, and also in the central North Sea, the model overestimates chlorophyll concentrations. Then, on the right-hand side at the bottom is a picture of the correlation coefficient, and this represents to what extent the variability in the model is similar to the variability that was seen in the satellite observations. And here we can see that in general, the larger this number, the better the model corresponds to the observations. And we can see that over large areas, we get a good representation of the observed variability. So now moving on to some results, what you see in these pictures is a similar representation as we've seen for the tidal signal, where we've taken the 8 gigawatt scenario, because the 800 megawatt scenario, so the licensed scenario, did not see very much impact of the tidal turbines. So these pictures show the difference between the 8 gigawatt scenario and the reference scenario without turbines for a number of chosen variables in the model, and I've organized them here in such a way that they sort of walk through the process that happens through the ecosystem. So that in the top left-hand corner is a picture of the difference in bed shear stress in the model for the 8 gigawatt scenario, and we can see that this sort of reflects the difference in tidal amplitudes that we saw, with a reduction in bed shear stress in the 8 gigawatt scenario along the east coast of the UK. And this seems to focus on an area in the south, sort of around centered around the wash over here. And this is an area that is fairly small, fairly shallow, with relatively high tidal currents. So for that reason, the effect of the tidal turbine seems to focus there. And if we move over to the right, and the figure in the top right-hand corner shows the difference in suspended sediment concentrations, which results in the model, which results from this reduction in bed shear stress. And you can see a clear reduction in suspended sediment concentrations in that same area. Now, because suspended sediment absorbs light in the water, and light is required for phytoplankton to grow, a reduction in suspended sediment concentrations means that you're getting more light in the water. So if we move down to the middle figure on the left, we can see the difference in net primary production for the 8 gigawatt scenario, and indeed in this area, which is light limited, and where nutrients are available sort of throughout the year, we can see that this reduction in suspended sediment concentrations increases the net primary production, so we get more phytoplankton. And this in turn, if we move over to the middle figure on the right, leads to a reduction in average nutrient concentrations. Of course, the phytoplankton is a source of food for zooplankton, and you can see that in the bottom figure on the right that there's an increase in zooplankton concentrations in the same area, and this effect also feeds into the benthic system, where I've plotted it in the bottom right-hand corner the biomass of suspension feeders, and this is increased in this particular area. And the changes that you can see are of the order of about 5 to 10% of there in the reference simulation. So this brings me to the conclusions. If we look at just look at the tides, then for the 800 megawatt scenario, we see a very small effect in the model that's probably not measurable. For the 8 gigawatt scenario, a small effect that extends all the way down to the southern bight of the North Sea, and that would be measurable. Looking at the biogeochemistry, we could not detect with this model an effect at this scale for the 800 megawatt scenario, but the 8 gigawatt scenario showed a small increase in production and biomass in a large area centered around the wash. I will not talk about this last conclusion, but because I didn't show you any results of that. The process that drives these is reductions in the bed shear stress, an increase or a decrease in suspended sediment concentrations, and hence a decrease in light limitation, which improves primary production. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, this is Pia now from Queen's University Belfast, and I'm going to get my presentation now. Thank you. And get rid of that. Sorry. And I'm going to look at the potential local and regional effects of large-scale tidal array energy device arrays on the phytoplankton dynamics. As we have just heard from Johan, who had like this huge, very large-scale model, we're going to look at the going back to using Mike 21 and looking at a model very similar to the one that Louise has introduced before on the idealized channel. And I'm going to explore the local, near-field, and far-field impact of large-scale tidal arrays on basically the phytoplankton dynamics. Phytoplankton dynamics are highly important for the local environment and can have impacts on the zooplankton and further afield on general productivity. In the my area reaches up to about 50 kilometers away from a tidal array, and I'm going to use a 2D coupled hydrodynamic and NPZD model, and especially using Mike DHI, an idealized model, which I'm going to show in a moment. It's very similar to the one that Louise introduced previously. And additionally, which is a more recent study, I'm going to investigate the impact of mussels, which might be settling on the structure, such as the tidal piles and things like that, which they might have on phytoplankton. So this is the hydrodynamic model, which has been previously introduced, or very similar. We've got a basin, which is now increased in size. It's different depths as well. We've got the channel here, which we had before as well, with the 55 tidal turbines. In this project, in this investigation, I just looked at two scenarios, a control without any turbines and one with the 55 tidal turbines. And we've got the outside area here. Those points here are sampling points at which I actually took the measurements of zooplankton, phytoplankton, nutrient, and detritus concentrations throughout the model. So I took them over a year. My time steps were 15 minutes, as we had a whole year's run. And yes, we measured the concentrations at a 15-minute intervals as well. And then I took the daily averages. This is our NPZD model. We've got 4 state variables. We've got the nutrients, we've got the phytoplankton, the detritus, and the zooplankton. And we've got here the different relations between the various state variables. For example, the phytoplankton uses the nutrients, and with the impact of the sun, the phytoplankton grows. So this is a very basic scheme of how my model works. All our concentrations of those state variables are generic, so we don't have any specific phytoplankton. Different phytoplankton species might actually react slightly different. They might have a different death rate. They might have a different growth rate. The same for the zooplankton rates. We've only got one zooplankton. We've only got a combined version of nutrients. So in that way, it's quite simple. However, we just try to actually understand what is happening if we introduce the 55 turbines, and it is very difficult to get all the data that you would need to run this NPZD model with real numbers. So the values I took for the different processes are basically values I got from literature. What kind of simulations did we did? I did a 5-year startup period, and then I had 4 radiation scenarios, which I just called A to D. Those radiation scenarios are actually based on light measurements we have from Strangford Lough, which actually is a very, I would say it represents very well the northern European weather conditions. And each scenario I had a control run without turbines and one with 55 turbines. I recorded the phytoplankton concentrations at all the 25 points I just showed on the previous slide. I did not further investigate the other concentrations, as this would have been too much. And I then calculated the annual average and the maximal concentrations for at each of the points, as well as the daily average concentrations. Now, as a result, we've got one picture here. The residence time in the basin increased with introduction of the turbines. So basically, that's just on the hydrodynamics. We have, as we had previously shown in Louise's talk, a slight change in the current speeds, but we also had the residence time in the basin increased with the turbines. And this is a change in the basin on our phytoplankton dynamics. We normally started in October, and it went the 1st of October, and the year ended in the 29th of September. Can I just click that away? And the 4 different colors actually just mark the 4 different scenarios we had, A to D. And they're not consecutive years necessarily, so they're just called A to D. So the solid lines represent the control, and the dotted lines actually represent the scenario with an array of 55 turbines. And we can actually see that the difference just in power in radiation has got a much higher impact on the phytoplankton dynamics than an introduction of 55 tidal turbines. The arrays of 55 tidal turbines, the approximate had a difference in the average annual concentration of about 20%, while the average concentration with radiation was about up to 60%. Now, I just said we also investigated mussel settling on structures. This is not a picture from us. We tried to have a look at the CGen, but sadly our pictures weren't as nice. However, it just shows how tight mussels actually can settle on structures, and especially the piles we put in. If you put in 55 piles of tidal turbines, they're all having about an area of 80 square meters. So that would give mussels an optimal place to settle. And if we have mussels settling like this, mussels actually have a strong impact on phytoplankton dynamics. They basically filter out phytoplankton and detritus out of the water flow and produce ammonium, which then again feeds back into the nutrients and can be picked up by the phytoplankton again. So that's the problem with a lot of mussel farms, that they then have changes. And I wanted to investigate if we have all those structures in the water, would that have been an additional impact on the phytoplankton dynamics? Now, I slightly changed the NPZD, I extended the NPZD models with an extra state variable called the mussels. So the mussels are filtering, as I said, the phytoplankton as well as the detritus, and excrete ammonium. They filter as well to a degree on the zooplankton. Now, the simulations, I used the same setup as before. However, I only used one power scenario, one light scenario. I had a control which only had some mussel cover in the basin, but a very low mussel cover. And then I had 3 scenarios with the full bottom cover of mussels in the channel, and a control mussel cover in the basin. So I had low, medium, and high of covering the whole channel. I had like 100 grams per mussels per square meter, 1,000 and 5,000. Now, why I decided to actually cover the whole channel was that I wanted to test an extreme event. So then I had additionally 3 scenarios where I had no mussels in the channel, but I had the whole basin covered in the same kind of conditions with low, medium, and high concentrations of mussels. That is 100 grams per square meter, 1,000 grams per square meter, and 5,000 grams per square meter. And I measured the phytoplankton nutrient concentrations in the basin and in the channel only. I just did not measure anywhere outside of the channel. Now, the results that we have from the basin. Now, the yellow figures are for the phytoplankton nutrient concentration in the low with a low cover in the basin. The green is the medium cover in the basin, and the blue relates to the highest cover of mussels in the basin. And you can see from, if we have the lowest cover in the basin, which is the same actually as the control, it was on top of each other, so that's why I didn't just play the control anymore. We've got the nutrient concentration going like this, and then we've got the grow in phytoplankton and decrease in phytoplankton. Now, if we have got the 1,000 grams of mussels per square meter, which is this green one, we've got the same. We've got a stronger increase in the nutrient concentration, and we've got a stronger increase in phytoplankton concentration and a decrease again. So this is actually called a positive feedback. So we've got an increased mussel concentration, which then excrete more ammonium, which then again increases the growth of phytoplankton. Now, however, if we put the 5,000 grams of phytoplankton across the whole bottom in the basin, the picture looks totally different. We actually have a huge increase in the nutrient concentration, and we actually have got a very, very, very low phytoplankton concentration in the basin at any time. So if we do the same for the channel, so if we have the 100 grams, 1,000 grams, and 5,000 grams per square meter, we've got a slightly different picture. We have again, we've got the increase with the 1,000 grams, but we don't have this extreme decrease when we actually have the 5,000 grams. So it's far less obvious what's going on. We still have the lower phytoplankton concentrations and the extreme high nutrient concentrations with the 5,000 grams, but it's still a whole lot different from what we've seen before. So this is still a work in progress, but we've got some conclusions which are actually to say that we can use those coupled hydrodynamic and biogeochemical models to explore the possible effects of large-scale tidal device arrays on the local ecosystem, especially in the absence of any real data. And the impact on the phytoplankton dynamics of a basic introduction of a tidal array are a whole lot smaller than the actual annual natural variation in the phytoplankton concentrations. So they are significantly there. Those tidal energy devices actually increase the residence time of water in the basin, and this might actually have an impact on the phytoplankton concentration if there is an elevated nutrient input from a river source or something like that into the basin, which might then take a longer time to be removed from the basin. However, this will have to be further investigated, as in our current model this is not included, as well as having different types of phytoplankton and zooplankton that might have different reaction times. And so the effects of actually mussels settling on the structures are likely to be minimal or not as high, and this is probably due to the high flow speeds. Thank you very much.
Hello, welcome to my talk. I'm Paul Schmidt, I'm the next speaker, and I will share some thoughts on the noise emissions of tidal turbines and some ideas also on arrays of those. So noise emissions of tidal turbines have caused some concern over the last years, and now that these devices are actually going into the water and there is some planning for arrays, they are an important part of the environmental impact assessment, and regulatory bodies must actually assess their impact. The big issue is actually that, well, they will emit some noise, but even if there's noise, it must be assessed against the natural or already existing background noise. And there isn't too much agreement yet on actually the background noise in those extreme tidal flows. And because it's a very extreme environment, it's not actually easy to do those measurements. If we have all that data, of course, the things you're worried about is how do animals react to it? So will they try to evade the place where these devices are placed? So will it really be a loss of habitat, or will only migrating animals just change their path and just swim by if they can? From what we know until now, there won't be direct health effect like tissue damage or so on, as has been observed, for example, from hammering or piling work. So the noise levels are a lot lower, but we'll see that in a bit more detail later. As an example, I will just give you one measurement campaign that we performed here at Queen's University with the shuttle in-stream turbine at our test site in the Strangford Narrows. So just some main data. So the hub depth was 3.4 meters below the water surface. The seabed actually consists of a bedrock, and there are a couple of boulders lying around, but it's actually quite a solid bottom. And it is a fairly sheltered site, so we don't have any wave. Sea state is typically 1 to 0. But the currents are actually very strong. They go up to 4 meters per second. And what you can see now is some measurements of the ambient noise level. So at the bottom you can see the frequency and then the sound levels on the y-axis. And to give you an idea, we have what we believe is a representative 20-minute average. That's the red line. So that is what we believe is like a typical background sound at that time. As a contrast, we have a 1-minute average, which was the minimum noise level we recorded over 1 minute. And you can see it's like orders of magnitude lower. And also as a comparison, remember I said it's a very protected site, but if you compare that to like accepted deep water noise values that have been published by WENF, this is like similar to a sea state 6 in the open sea in deep water. Our minimum noise level in this range here already drops down to like a sea state 1, roughly. So there is quite a wide range, and this measurement was only over 1 week. And at the same time, we also did then turbine measurements, so with the turbine operating. And as I said, in these extreme tidal environments, it's not that easy to measure. So you can see the green line, which was a fixed measurement with the hydrophone actually at a fixed position, and you get a lot of flow noise passing by. So you can see there is quite some difference between the fixed measurement, which was like 9 meters away, that's the green line, compared to, for example, the drifting measurement, which we labeled here the blue line, that's labeled at 100 meters. So we took an average around the mean distance while it was drifting. So that would be like representative at 100 meters distance. And then we also have data 250 and 450 meters away. And we also plotted here the background noise levels. And what you can see here is actually that it takes 450 meters for that turbine here to reach background noise levels. So if you want to go extremely safe and just say the turbine will not have an effect if it's less noisy than the natural background noise levels at that site, or it will have no effect, then 450 meters would be like the range that it will disturb the environment. And as is customary, we actually corrected those noise levels back to a 1 meter distance from the turbine, and that is how turbine noise or noise levels are usually recorded to be used then in modeling. We used a very simple spreading law to correct it back, and you can see the 450 meter noise level does not fit the other lines perfectly well, so we are ignoring some of the losses that occur. But overall, we would say at around 1 kilohertz, if we say that's representative noise level of interest, we are roughly at 120 decibels. Now, why is that important? The issue really is, if we are just talking about tidal turbines, and there are people doing research on how certain animals are affected by noise, we don't really know how loud these turbines are. Remember, this was a measurement that was published in detail, but it was still only a 1-week measurement campaign. The turbine was operating only in 2 meters per second current. And also, that model was a prototype, and it has been changed already, so the data was published last year, and probably the new turbine is already less noisy. Like some of the noise we could hear, we know that it came from components that have been changed already. And if you look at environmental noise levels here, what we measured here in the Strangford Loch in between 20 and 60 meters water depth is the water depth where we did drifting measurements. It's a flow velocity of 4 meters per second, and we measured somewhere between 60 and 70 decibels. Up in EMAC, people have recorded an actually similar depth ranges, a lot more, like between 90 and 120. Over in the States, there have been data has been published in 60 meters water depth and slightly less flow, but they measured between 80 and 90. So there is a very wide discrepancy actually of environmental flow noise measurements. And coming back to turbines, which are really the new stressor in the environment that everyone talks about. The shuttle turbine, okay, we have one measurement that we might maybe trust. Some numbers have been reported, but this is not a comprehensive review, and some of the data are really just second-hand reports or some private information that has been passed on to someone else. So you need to take them with a pinch of salt, but the range is quite impressive. So the oldest is probably the marine current turbines device in the Bristol Channel. That was even recorded with 166 decibels, which is really, really high. The Verdant power plant was recorded as 145 decibels, but they already said that some blades had broken. So you might wonder how much noise was introduced by that. And also an old open hydro prototype was recorded as 160 decibels, which is also an old measurement, and we know that the prototype has evolved quite a lot over the years. Now, our question was somewhat, should you, for example, consider noise emissions in your array optimization or in your array layout, or is there actually anything we could do when we give out areas for concessions? Is there any advice you can give regulators in that sense? And if you just use a very simple numerical model, like just a very simple spreading law to correct your sound levels of the turbine with some transmission losses, if we really just use spherical spreading over the depth and then cylindrical spreading over the distance, we just have a flat bathymetry. It's really just to get a feeling for what ranges we are talking about. And now, as a default value, we just took the shuttle data we had available, so we say it's 80 decibels is the environmental level that we want to drop down to, and then we say we have no effect on the environment, and we assume 120 decibels for the turbine. And if you look at the plot here, so we have the position just in meters on the x and y axis, and then their noise levels plotted with the color, so you can see one turbine in the middle, and because it's a shuttle turbine, you can see roughly at 25 meters water depth, about 450 meters away from the turbine, we are back to ambient noise levels. The red line at the right corner, that triangle, is just an error in the plotting software. Apologies for that. Obviously, if you look at the formulas, it's quite obvious. If you go to deeper waters, the sound, if it spreads in all directions, as we assume in that simple model, it will dissipate a lot faster, and sound levels will drop much, much faster. So we are dropping back to ambient noise levels in maybe 200 meters distance. Also, if we combine turbines, like that might be an array, if we just stick turbines together again, the sound levels spread out in the range over hundreds and hundreds of meters. Another thing you might want to look at, roughly, because there's so much uncertainty in turbine noise levels and our source levels, if we just drop from 120 to 115 decibels, if we assume it, even our combined levels of single turbines, if you put them in an array, we drop by just hundreds of meters, and if we went down to 110 decibels as a source level, we would actually get areas between the turbines that are below our threshold that we considered as the ambient noise levels. So already coming to the conclusions, with our best guess at the moment, we can't really do much more than guessing because there isn't that much data available. Noise emissions really seem to be relevant over hundreds to thousands of meters. So with a typical turbine spacing, as has been used like in the turbine optimization tools that we've seen earlier, typically turbines would be hundreds or 30 to like less than 100 meters apart. So actually creating a space between turbines for animals to pass is probably not really an option. Another word of caution for this very simple model we used, of course in deep water it would spread easier, but we are ignoring quite significant losses that can occur in shallow water. But what we really want to highlight, before you go to any more elaborate modeling, what we really need is a lot more data from environmental and of turbine data. Thank you very much.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Julian Metcalf. I'm speaking from the CFAS lab in Lowestoft. And I want to talk a bit this afternoon at the end of this webinar about some work we've been doing developing a web-based application to try and characterize potential impact of marine renewable energy converters on marine ecosystems and fisheries. And this actually isn't going to be a modeling talk in the way that the others have been. And I have to stress that I'm not a modeler and I'm not a web person. I'm a fish biologist. The aim of this part of the project initially was to try and describe site-specific ecologies and then identify the type of modeling approach, various models you've already been hearing about, the type of modeling approach that you would use to assess the potential impacts of marine renewable energy converters on these ecologies. Early on in the program, we had a workshop here in Lowestoft to consider parameterizing, how we would parameterize these ecological processes. And we identified that what we would first need to do would be to compare and map potential locations of energy converting arrays to known spawning or nursery or feeding habitats for fish or migration routes for various important fish species or shellfish species, and then identify what the potential conflicts might be, and then go on to explore how best to model these effects of marine energy converters on these fish communities and these fish ecologies. More specifically, we identified that we'd need to describe generic species distributions, biological information and habitat requirements to do this, to describe the life history stages of the species that occur in a particular area, to identify potential impacts on those the impacted life history stages, to obtain area-specific data that we would need to assess those impacts, define site-specific data requirements, and then identify limits and apply methods to scale area data to particular study sites. So that's the sort of thing we were thinking about right at the beginning of the project to achieve what we were setting out to do. We identified 4 species that we were going to use as test cases in the pendant first. Firstly, herring as a pelagic species, which we know spawns in and around the area. Then brown crab as a static species, as a mostly static but movable species. Blue mussel as a static species, and then probably salmon or eel as a species that doesn't necessarily occur in that area, but is known to migrate through it. So we have different types of biologies and ecologies from different species in our study area. That was where we started. Looking at herring, if you look at the map on the left of the screen here, the green area shows the area around the UK where herring occur, and the purpley area is the area where spawning is known to occur. But the first problem we ran into is that the spatial scale of the biological information that's out there is totally inappropriate for the spatial scale of the sort of marine energy converting arrays that we're talking about. So when we started this work with herring, we had to develop methodologies which would allow us to bring this very generic broad-scale information down to much more specific spatial scale that was relevant. And to do that, we had to look at the specific biological characteristics of the species and see how that could help us. In the case of herring, for instance, whilst we know they spawn all around the north of Scotland, they lay their eggs on gravel beds, so actual spawning sites are only gravel beds. And then the larvae hatch and move into the water column, and they're transported around by water currents. So we were able to use specific biological understanding and distribution understanding to map at a finer scale where various life history stages were likely to be occurring, and then think about how the various impacts might affect the ecologies of these animals. And this, with the test case of herring, led us to this sort of situation where we had identified the red areas in the maps at the top are areas where there either is or has been spawning by herring, and the blue arrows are where the ocean currents move to carry the larvae. Using this information, we were then able to produce a grid, which is at the bottom part of this slide, where we identify the life history stage, the egg, the larvae, and the juveniles, and then the key features of those life history stages that are likely to be impacted, and then the potential conflict, both tidal and wave energies, and whether they're negative or whether they're likely to be positive. So we felt we were going in the right direction at this point, but up until now, all of this was by surfing for information, drawing out the information, and writing it into documents, either electronic documents or paper documents. We then moved on to consider some of the other species. This is where we got to when we were doing blue mussel, and the issues with blue mussel were completely different in terms of getting the right spatial scale for the information. The issues with blue mussel were quite different from what we've been doing for herring. And so whilst we were aiming to come up with the same sort of grid of key features and potential impacts of tidal and wave energy converters, we found that we were needing a completely different approach, or relatively different approach. And as we proceeded down this route, we got to the point where we felt doing this in a sort of fairly conventional impact assessment type method, where you were accumulating lots of information, pulling out the bits of information that you felt was relevant, and then putting that down in a document, either a paper document or an electronic document, was probably not the most efficient and effective. So we, for a moment, when I say a moment, it was a while, we dabbled, in this case, in this illustration, with an Excel spreadsheet version, where we had hyperlinks in our grid, which would take the user through to much wider bits of information about, in this case, as you can see, about blue mussel, which is just an example. So you would click on, I'm not going to, click on blue mussel and the life stage, and it would take you through to the information that you needed to assess what type of modeling approach you might want to use to assess the impact. It was very clear to us at this early stage that Excel was not going to be man enough, anything like man enough for the job we wanted to do. And with a few changes of staff, we started to develop a much wider thought about how we could go about doing this taking advantage of the internet and various other electronic processes that are available to us. And we came out first with this rather simplistic idea where we'd have three stages, three components. On the left-hand side, we'd be identifying the species of interest and the life history stages. In the middle, we'd be identifying the type of impacts that might occur, and then the ways in which we might assess those impacts. So that was the initial idea. When we started working out how you might do all this using the power of the internet and various other things, it became quite a bit more complicated, and this is sort of a sketch diagram of where our thinking has got to at the moment. But the idea is there would be a lot of access through the internet, through media wikis and various other tools, to provide a tool whereby anyone could go to an area, identify where they might want to put a device or an array of devices, identify what species are there because the tool will have access to that sort of spatial information, and then drill down through those various layers of information to find out what they needed to know, what the potential impacts are likely to be, and what the modeling approaches that they ought to be taking to try and address, understand and assess those impacts are likely to be. The philosophy here is to try and keep the amount of stuff that's hard written into the tool at a minimum, and that as much of the information that it's using is out there electronically, so that it was quite clear to us that the minute you start to write something, either electronically or on paper, it starts to go out of date immediately as information in the real world gets updated. So the idea was to have a tool which would be accessing data in the real world, so as that data changes, the way in which the tool tells you what you ought to be thinking about and the sorts of modeling approaches you might use, how that would all work. Okay. So the sorts of data layers that we envisaged would be there would be a query layer, which will allow you to identify what species information exists for your particular area, what the life history stages are, and what the specific habitat requirements of those species and life history stages are. There could be an economic value layer, which identifies the ecological conservation and economic value of those species. Species range and distribution, importance of specific area to that species. There could be a fishing activity layer, so that as you start to identify what species of fish are there, you'll also be able to identify fishing activity that is there, and therefore you can start to understand how fishing sectors might be impacted. It would also allow you to be able to identify knowledge gaps and data limitations, and the methods that might be used to scale the data appropriately so you can apply to a particular study site. And the idea is that also the data that the tool is accessing would be date stamped, so that you'd also have an idea of how old a particular piece of information was and whether it's probably out of date or whether it is still current. The system would then go on to be able to start defining modeling requirements and the methods to assess the risks and predict impacts. And then ultimately identify any monitoring requirements and key indicators that you might be interested. What I should point out again is that the idea is to provide a tool that identifies risks and modeling approaches that might be used to assess the potential impacts of these risks. It's not intended to do the specific impact assessment itself. I'm not getting my next page.
Julian, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Sorry, was that the end of your presentation?
No, sorry, it's
Okay, great. Okay.
Right, it's up and running again. This is an example of at a very high level, a species distribution layer that we would hope to have in this sort of tool. Recently, a colleague here with some others has just published a fish atlas, which provides spatial information on distribution and abundance of something in the region of 175 species of fish. And whilst this data isn't currently available electronically, we are negotiating, or we are planning to talk to the authors of this guide about having this sort of information available electronically. So this is where we've got to. This is just a sort of schematic of the way in which we have built what we've built so far. Over on the left of this picture identifies the database, the GeoServer, various other components. The ones in blue we've already built. The ones with a pink bit at the bottom are things that we've identified would need to be connected, but we haven't built them yet. And the other parts just give you an indication of the sort of methodologies that we've been implementing to build this tool. The idea is that we could go, and this is an example of a prototype example of how you would select an area, in this case the pendulum first. You would then identify what species are present in that area, what life stages are present in that area. You would select which species and life stages you were interested in. It would identify the likely impacts and the risks and take you through to the types of modeling approaches you would probably need to use to understand what those risks and what the likely impacts are. So again, it's not doing the impact assessment for you, but it's telling you what's in the area that's interested, what's likely to be impacted, and what's the modeling approach that you would need to assess that impact. And this is just an example of how that might look when you're actually running it. So here, again, for blue mussel as an example, it's giving you the distribution of blue mussels. It's telling you something about the importance of blue mussels, their commercial exploitation, conservation, and ecosystem, and then some life history information, the eggs, the larvae, and the juveniles. So that's how we would think this system would actually look when you were using it. So this is the question we're putting out to you, because we're biologists. Are we reinventing a wheel? Does this or something similar already exist out there, and are people using it? That's what we originally thought, but we haven't had any feedback yet from anyone who said that there's something, this already exists, and people have shown a lot of interest that something like this should exist. Another question is there something similar like this that we might learn from? So are there other technological approaches like this that might help us to advance this in a useful and meaningful way? Is there interest out there in supporting or being involved in the future development of this tool? Because we certainly haven't got anywhere near the end of it yet. Maybe as part of a follow-on project, a LINC project. And what funding structures might there be to support such a follow-on project, or this as a component of that? And this is how we think a project would sort of look. There would be a work package based on developing the tool. We would have expert groups that would consider particular impacts so that we could learn what those impacts are likely to be and how best to put those into the tool. We would have modeling expert working groups that would identify the various modeling approaches, and the sort of thing you've already heard this afternoon would include things like that. From our point of view, we think something like this would be of value to developers, because they could go to particular areas and identify what species are likely to be at risk and what modeling approaches they may need to be thinking about to work out what those risks are likely to be and how they might mitigate them. It would be of use to regulators, because they could do the same sort of thing, but from the other side. And stakeholders and conservationists, they too could go to a specific area where somebody or an organization is talking about developing for marine renewable and find out what the issues are likely to be. And so there's the capacity to start a dialogue on the modeling approaches, the risks, and how impacts should be assessed right from the beginning through a web-based tool like this, which is available to everybody. Okay, thank you very much.
Julian, thank you very much. I'll just take back here the presentation, if you don't mind. And so thank you everybody for listening in. First of all, thank you to Dave, Louise, Johan, Pia, Paul, and Julian for presentations. And I'm just going back to well, questions, essentially. If I get the slide up. So, yes, your questions, please. If you could use the functionality to send a note to all presenters for your questions, which is in the top right menu. And please state the presenter you're asking the questions, or all if it's to all, if it's a more general question. We already have a number of questions in, and I think Jonathan and I will try and moderate those as far as possible. Apologies if we miss any questions coming in. Maybe just have to resend them. But yeah, I don't know, Dave, are you still in the line?
Yep. Hello.
Hi, Dave.
Hello.
So I think I'll just start with a question to you first, and maybe if we can try and get initially through the order. But if there are questions coming down later on, we can obviously go back. Dave, so you've shown a lot on the different array configurations and optimizations, and obviously the primary focus of a lot of the modeling has been on improving the power output. But I guess it's fair enough to say, and maybe if you could comment on that, that really power output was just one of the things that you've used. In principle, you could use other constraints. I mean, you talked about environmental constraints a little bit, so maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yep, so we've done quite a bit of work on trying to build in realistic objectives and constraints. So the work that I've mostly done in that area has been looking at incorporating more realistic financial models. So, for example, the cost of cable and how that plays against power maximization strategy. But my colleague Rowan, who produced the two slides on the environmental constraints, he's working on those and using minimization of environmental impact as an objective. So he's kind of coming at it at two scales because of the sort of low resolution of environmental information at a sort of global or national scale model. He's using the Ocean Health Index, which is sort of a proposed method of classifying ocean health put forward by Ben Halpern, to look at what sites might host turbine arrays, minimizing the impact to that ocean health index. So that's more of a site selection, and that would be using the continuum turbine approach I was talking about towards the end. And then on a smaller scale, yeah, those sort of eco zones that I showed. So if there's a particular bay that is hosting, a particular piece of wildlife that we're especially interested in, then the problem is more how we can objectively and numerically quantify benefit or damage to the environment, so that it can go into the numerical optimization framework. The problem is quantification rather than integration. So it's sort of the biology side that's more problematic than the mathematical side for this problem.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I don't think we have any questions for Lee at the moment on the particle tracking, but I think I've got two questions for Johan. Johan, are you still?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
I can see the question from Scott Merriam asking about whether or not over a larger area the positive and negative changes that I found in my model cancel out to essentially zero, so that overall there's no net change. I agree that if you look at these pictures, then a larger area average will be smaller than the larger changes that you may see in particular regions. There's no reason why there could not be a net change overall, as far as I can see from what I know the model does. However, it's not possible or trivial to actually answer this question with the current model results, and this is because of stochastic processes in the models such as eddy formation, which are different, which can be different in each model run that you do. So if I were to do two model runs that should be identical without turbines in, then I still get differences between the two simulations. And if you recall the maps, then there were large white areas in the maps, and in those areas I had to apply filters based on the difference between two identical simulations to filter out areas where the difference between the scenario run and the reference run was not significant. So, and as soon as you start to do that, it becomes sort of a matter of chance how large the area is that you're still considering. So it's not really possible to then go and calculate the budget of the particular variable that you look at.
Johan, thank you. I hope that has answered the question. Johan, one other question. Obviously, in the consortium, we had quite a lot of discussion about the potential possible scenarios that we should, or you should model in the Pentland Firth, and I think actually the 800 megawatt versus the 9 gigawatt is quite an interesting one. Do you want to maybe briefly comment a little bit more on also in terms of a likely scenario of that, or likelihood of that scenario?
Well, that's difficult to say, because to some extent it depends on the number of factors, and one of which is the actual ultimate success of the industry to create tidal turbine systems and arrays that are economically viable. If that happens to the extent that the wind industry is currently able to achieve, then of course such large scenarios become possible, whether that's concentrated in the Pentland Firth or more distributed over larger areas along the coast. And because the tidal energy and tidal waves travel around the coast, they would sort of integrate the effects of multiple tidal farms as they encounter them on their way. So in order to achieve these effects, you may not need to concentrate all that power extraction in one particular location. It might well be that if you add up multiple smaller farms, you might get similar effects. But of course, all of that would require further investigation at the time when these things become relevant.
Okay, thanks, Johan. I think we have a few questions which are probably quite brief for Pal. So first of all, one question was along whether there was any comparison between direct drive and gearbox drive. Pal?
So from the data available, I'm not aware of any study that did that directly. I think it's too early from the little data that is available to draw any conclusions.
Okay. So, yeah, the industry is probably not quite ready yet for that. Modulation of noise. Was there much modulation of the noise of one turbine?
So in those shuttle tests, we did actually show some variations during different operating regimes. Overall, for like environmental assessments, I'm not too sure. Again, like there isn't enough data. For example, like that turbine was only tested in up to 2 meters per second. It should be, or very similar turbine should operate up to like in flows of 4 meters per second. So yeah, it's hard to guess. It's not like we couldn't give you like different noise levels now for different operating states.
Okay, and then one final question. Paul, you've basically modeled arrays linearly, or did you see any cancellation of noise between different turbines?
Well, the model I showed is far too simple. Like it wouldn't show any cancellation or so. It really just adds up the noise levels at each position for coherent noise. It's really far too simple for that. We did consider more complex noise models, but the idea was really, since it all depends on your boundary conditions, and we don't really have enough data for qualified answers. Like for what we were looking for is like array effects and whether there was any purpose in changing the array layout, for example, to change noise emissions or so. We thought that was enough for now. In the future, that might be an option, but I don't, like from what we've seen, I don't think very carefully that will really make much of a difference.
I think in order to have noise cancellation, you have to have a certain phase relationship as well, and certainly the data that we have, I think, would suggest that there's such a fluctuation in pitch and so on of the noise that that's quite unlikely that I could actually see reasonable phase cancellation. Okay, so as far as I can see at the moment, we don't have actually any further questions right now. So I'll just hand back to Jonathan at this stage.
Great, thank you, Bjorn. Thank you to everyone for making it out. Just once again, I want to let you know that the TFIS page is where you'll be able to find a recording of this presentation if you want to share it with anyone. I just sent out the link again. We'll also mount the presentations there. And if you do have any further questions, you're welcome to comment at the bottom of that page. Just so you know, the video may take a couple of days to be finished with processing. But other than that, thank you for your time, and thank you to all the presenters. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.